Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. This week I'm talking to my friend and colleague Anthony Pellecchia, who has had a long and illustrious career beginning in New Jersey and then working with Louis Kahn and KPF. While also establishing and running his own practice, first in Philadelphia, then in a new iteration in Denver, and then finally as Wesselman Pellecchia Architects here in Seattle. He's now retired and spends his time not retired from architectural thinking, but simply from professional practice. He's developing a series of conceptual projects imagining the future of architecture, the future of the city, the future of inhabitation itself. I talked to him about his life and career and his speculative projects. It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Anthony.
Thank you.
So, Anthony, you live here in Seattle and in Port Townsend. And now you are the author of a fascinating and interesting, I would describe this as a conceptual practice, which involves art, architecture, some writings, and open-ended speculations on the future of cities and architectural thinking. But this comes as part of, and towards the end of this illustrious career, I would say. Starting off, I think you grew up in New Jersey, in Hoboken, and then you practiced in Philadelphia, working with Kahn, and then on your own. And then you joined the sort of still mid-sized firm of KPF.
Probably fairly large now.
Now, of course, KPF's huge, but at that time, I don't think.
No, there were about 40 people.
40 people,
yeah.
And then you practiced again on your own in Colorado, in Denver.
Yes.
And then from Denver, we got you here in Seattle, where you had Wesselman Pellecchia Architects with Kathy, your wife.
Associates, but we did both graphic design and architecture.
Graphic design and architecture, right. And sort of a intermingled practice.
Right.
And now both of you are retired and doing your own things.
Yeah, what we like to say is we retired WPA.
Okay, but
so
you're not retired.
Both of us continue to work.
Continue to work.
Our own work.
But doing your own things.
Yes.
So let's start with your thing. What are you working on? You're working on a series of speculative projects on the future of the city and some paintings. These, from what I remember from a presentation I attended of yours recently at Rob Hutchison's, imagine another kind of living, another kind of city in the air. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just another expression of various ideas that have existed for many years. I mean, you have the Japanese were, Isusaki and others were doing designs above Tokyo. You had, and then there were other iterations.
Right.
Discovered
Metabolists for sure.
Metabolists, yes, yeah. And definitely. And you had Peter Cook, and his cohorts, and
Archie
you had
Graham,
Archie Graham, and then you had, in some respects, you had Corbu, and then you could. They weren't in the air, but they were large structures. They were sort of that dealt with the kind of density and a relationship with the landscape that I think was critical in a division, a separation between how people thought about how humans would live. Right? My thinking has to do with, and I think it's at an appropriate time because our environment is shambles and our conditions are we don't have a lot of time to deal with the issues. And so I think that some big ideas and some big thoughts need to be put into it. And I think that the density is important. I think we need to control how we relate to nature.
Yeah.
So the idea, the concept of building above what exists, right?
So you're proposing these sort of cities which kind of not float, but are suspended in the air.
Yeah, they're, these skyways, if you will.
Skyways, yes.
And
long skyways, very dense, long skyways.
Right, with some large...
At least 20 stories high, tall, above the ground.
Easily,
yeah.
And, part of that is important because it doesn't destroy what exists on the ground plane.
The idea is to leave the ground plane pristine.
Well, eventually, the ground plane we would do this in one consideration, we'd do it in relationship to realizing that we have other creatures that
share the earth
rather than us dominating it.
Well, we're encroaching on the birds.
But the birds can still be in the trees, and they'll fly up to the and join us. Join the humans up there and build nests, and that won't be a problem for the birds.
So
they also live in. I discovered with being out in Port Townsend that many birds live on the ground plane in bushes and actually build nests in the ground too. So they're very interesting creatures.
Well, okay.
But anyway,
I just see that living in the air does have a Icarus quality.
Yes, oh yes. The other aspects of the design is that it's very intentionally not a grid. The geometry is very irregular and it varies considerably.
Why?
There are two reasons. One, I think the grid and its origins are basically for land ownership and the purchase of land.
Right.
Okay.
So this is against property ownership.
This is against property ownership.
Yeah.
Okay. This is not a new idea.
No. I'm not crediting you with new ideas. I'm just crediting you with interesting ideas.
Yeah. Okay. So, so there's that aspect of it, and the other thing is that
no, but it's more than just define property. All the
that's where
your drawings are so rich.
Yeah.
They potentially sustain a rich kind of a different kind of a life.
Also concerned about the fact that we've lost public spaces. We keep so much of what is being built, and it would be interesting to understand the percentage of construction that has taken place from the 70s to today versus that same amount of time prior to that.
Right.
Okay. Because I think that would probably be an interesting statistic. But to get back to the various configurations of these sort of images that exist above the ground plane, they're purposefully not specific in consistent geometry, so that spaces can be found and not demanded as commercial space by developers.
So you'll allow any program in any space?
Well, I'm trying
No zoning?
Well, yeah, I'm not that interested in zoning. I think zoning needs to be totally reconsidered. Yeah, I think that. Plus, I think zoning is way outdated, and unfortunately.
So, what's your replacement proposal for zoning?
I don't know. I haven't thought of it. All of this is very complex, and it would require a variety of people to participate in it, not just me or other architects, but planners, landscape architects, scientists. There's an interesting. I'm reading the Sixth Extinction, and there are these coral reefs that grow and support themselves and so on, which are in trouble. They support hundreds of thousands of living creatures.
Right.
So there's this sympathetic relationship that
Yeah.
the coral reef has with all these other things, unlike humans.
Yeah. We
which
keep things out.
we destroy.
We destroy.
And eliminate.
So do you think of this like this massive coral reef in the sky?
Well, I mean, that's the similarity is only that it allows other living creatures to coexist on the portions of the land that we took away from them. So we kind of leave where they are by going above. Now, obviously, there'll need to be connections, and there'll be some density on the ground, but not to the degree that exists today.
What is the origin of this deep sympathy for the non-human in your work? I mean, are you very partial to animals, or?
Oh, yeah, I am. Yeah,
Where
but
does this come from?
It's just it's a fairness. It has to do with
Sure, but why?
a belief that maybe it's a belief that that the human race is not superior. That man is.
Why do you think that it's not superior? We can
Whoa.
think. Come on.
So,
I'm not.
So can other creatures. I mean,
Uh-huh.
we haven't. We're finally spending time. It's fairly, Darwin. I mean, was the breakthrough, right, of understanding the ability that other creatures have, and we're continuing to learn more and more about them. But
Right.
the downside of it is that the human race is historically not the best example to model the future, right?
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah,
Non-human species are diverse and rich and have all kinds of abilities. This idea that the only species that matters is human and everything else is property is extremely damaging.
I think another aspect that architects need to be aware of, and many are, but we're not this isolated profession. I understand that, I've had clients, right? So there's that realization. But if we decide to do some of the current things that I've been thinking about, society needs, all aspects of society needs to participate in it. Otherwise, it's not going to be realized. That not even the form it's in, but just the thinking and the possibility of something like that taking place. So we are very much a part of the rest of society.
Sure.
And I think that relating back to an interest in the amount of construction that took place from, say, the 70s and 80s to today, there's a concern I have, and I realized it went back in the 70s, going from Philadelphia back to New York, and going from my own firm and Marshall and my firm, and then Kahn's, and then going to a larger firm that was doing a lot of corporate headquarters.
Right.
There's a danger of the architect becoming a kind of service rather than a builder, right, a maker of things. And this is where Kahn was unique, I think, in that he was given programs, but he studied the program and wanted to understand the nature of it and the institutional aspect of it.
Right.
And therefore, he sort of incorporated other aspects of the design that increased the program. So there were various spaces and aspects of the design that he brought to it that wasn't given to him by an owner.
Yeah, I mean, he thought of architecture as the work of constructing the edifice of which the client and the program were only a part. I mean, it was a contribution to life.
Life, society, too.
Society
right.
and life.
Yes.
Beyond society,
Right.
just life itself.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me, when I look at your drawings and your paintings and your sort of these dense, non-orthogonal proposals for cities in the air, it does remind me of European towns and old Indian towns and
Arabic towns.
and So it seems decisively anti-modern, if I may say so.
Well, as, you know, I mean, you know that I'm interested in history.
Yeah.
History of architecture, and now we have I have had an opportunity to study architecture from other parts of the world other than Europe. And you're exactly right. I mean, the configurations of, I'm really enamored with medieval towns, and then the horizontal sort of plans that exist in Arab countries and in India, you know, and so on. I mean, I mean, I think that they had different criteria.
Right.
You know, so again, one has to understand the socioeconomic aspect of those cultures to understand further why the architecture is the way it is. So, which I continue to believe we need, as architects, spend more time understanding what's going on today. And
do you have a good memory, a distinctive memory, when you were in a non-gridded town and something struck you and you said, aha? Was there an aha moment connected with urban experience and in a European city?
Probably
or
in the older, well, there is. I mean, I'm enamored with, again, the non-gridded, if you will, where the automobile dominated the plan of an urban place. And so there's a distinctive difference between linear movement and more centralized movement. And you can think of Palermo, you can think of Rome, you could think of many old cities where you have these great spaces that people gather in, and then you have other spaces where it tightens up and people are moving linear, in a linear manner. And so there's a variety of spaces that one is moving through, and they do different things in them. Today we're burdened by the automobile and the sidewalk and the street, and it's repetitious. And then beyond that, we have commerce, and it becomes, again, repetitious. I mean, so I think that we, particularly in this country, we don't have the history that other places in other parts of the world have.
Right. I mean, it seems to me, this is, you're referring to Italian towns and, Sicilian towns, Italian towns. And that, of course, connects to your heritage. I know you're born and brought up in your
Hoboken, Italian.
Yeah, so this is where I'm going. There's a big difference between Palermo and where you grew up, Hoboken.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And is that the dialogue in your head, like Palermo versus Hoboken, to put it in a shorthand?
No. I mean, I think the one similarity may be the urban aspect of it. I mean,
yeah, but you're critiquing the grid of Hoboken, no?
Yes. It's definitely the grid of the automobile.
The grid of the automobile, the grid of private property.
Ownership, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so I haven't lived in Hoboken for years. I didn't choose that.
Do you choose to distance yourself from Hoboken?
Well, there's nothing there any longer, right, for me to remain there.
Right.
And
but you were once telling me that Peter Smithson came to your office in Philadelphia, and when he found out that you were from Hoboken, what did he say?
Well, he thought it was sort of one of the worst places he had ever been.
So would you agree?
No.
Yeah, I thought not.
Yeah. I wasn't aware that I grew up and came from what was perceived by other people, that Hoboken was such a terrible place in their minds.
Yeah.
In fact, even afterwards, when I was in Philadelphia and Marshall and I had our office. Yeah. Smithson visited our office because we were working on the Yale Center, and he was teaching there that semester. And somehow we got talking about where we were from, and I mentioned Hoboken, and he was horrified.
Horrified?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of how awful a place it was, and I don't know how he ever experienced it. Maybe, you know, ships used to dock there and leave from there.
So Peter Smithson in London thinks that Hoboken is the dumps.
It was, a little, even, you know, the ass end of the United States. And so, but anyway, but it was when I went to the University of Illinois that it had this reputation that I was unaware of because, you know.
You just thought it was home.
Well, it was home, but also I lived in I had a very ideal situation. I mean, it was the whole sort of 3 generations were living in this 4-story building.
Yeah.
And my aunt and uncle lived on the 1st floor.
Multi-generational living.
Yes, and so we lived on the 2nd. My grandparents and uncle lived on the 3rd, and they rented the 4th floor. And all the food came from my grandmother because everyone else worked outside.
But that's what the waspy world thought was like. You know, the Italians just crowding the place.
Right. Well, you know, and so that's an interesting point. Okay, that I take into. That I'm aware of today.
Yeah.
And I think one of our problems that we have that has been magnified in that there's this division between the people who think they're Americans. And I was reminded in Italy at a museum once in Sicily when I mentioned that I was from America, and he said north or south.
Right.
Okay.
No, of course.
Yeah.
I know that.
Okay, a little sideline.
But that's a different.
Well, yes, that's another issue. But there is this cultural thing that somehow the group of people who consider themselves Americans have forgotten where they came from.
Yeah.
You know, they've left that culture.
Yeah.
You know, behind.
Yeah.
And there are those of us who don't want to forget it, who have taken it, brought us here, you know, from our past, our ancestors.
Yeah.
And we're made up, when you look at what this country is culturally, it's a combination of cultures from all over the world.
Right.
And that's its greatness.
That is its greatness.
That's its virtue.
But it's a long-standing conflict between that as its greatness versus those who believe that its greatness lies in a sort of a singular origin.
And so I've resisted, to become more personal about it, I've resisted making that transformation, you know, and becoming, I'm going to say white, okay? And it's, you know, simplistic term.
Right.
And I want to retain that, that history and that connection. Because I believe that that's the way the whole world is.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have the divisions.
We shouldn't have the divisions.
Okay.
Yeah. And multicultural America makes it a richer and better America.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, you know, that's.
Let's talk about Grounded Angel.
Yeah.
1992, I think.
Yes.
It's a beautiful project. It kind of imagines a trough, a kind of like a floating mummy case in the air.
There are a lot of references to Egyptian and Viking, you know, vessels, and yes, I mean.
But it contains toxic waste.
Yes, you know, it was a large. There was a very significant conference in Denver at the time, and primarily attended by scientists who were concerned about how toxic waste of all forms was being stored. And there were a number of articles in various journals about the possibility of 1,000 years from now someone excavating an area, and there they find toxic waste that's still dangerous. Yeah,
uranium still decaying.
And so I was interested in sort of having an influence on making people aware of this condition.
So why put it in a mummy?
Well, I wanted to get it out of the ground because in the ground it's invisible,
out of
and it
sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And this was also one of the, you know, what the scientists were talking about, because what they had a lot of this waste in was deteriorating, and it then was getting in the ground, in the water, and so on. And there happened to be a large site that contained a lot of this waste. It would be right next to the airport in Denver.
Right.
Which that land was going to be annexed and turned into a variety of. It was all going to be
So
part
you
of an
wanted
urban
to
renewal complex.
put it into the public
So I wanted to
eye.
get it above the ground. I wanted it to be on display, and I wanted it to be in a sort of symbolic image, and I wanted it to be seen from the air, also. And so it's 300 feet long. The length of a football field, so it has some scale to it. It's translucent. At night, it would glow. There's another sort of reference there.
Glow because of the toxic
Well,
stuff inside,
no,
or you
that-
would make it glow?
It would be illuminated so that it were visible.
Right.
And then the other aspect of it is that it sits in these glass vessels that are have references to exotic oils that Romans would store their, these precious oils in, and so there's a lot of historical references, so that the symbolism of it has some connection to previous societies and iconography.
Right. But it sort of has an ironic quality to it, in the sense that, putting this in the air and then in these vessels which were used for perfumes, sort of says, but we've got toxic waste in there.
Right, but at the same time, the scientists had determined that the best way to store a lot of this material was in glass vessels rather than metal.
I see. Why?
Because the glass wouldn't deteriorate.
Unlike metal.
Unlike metal, yes. And obviously there was a thickness to it, and so that was. So I didn't make that up. That was something that I learned from reading and one of the discussions in the conference. So it was a 3-day conference. I got interested in it. I happened to attend it, and that sort of started the whole thing. But it was also my interest as an architect to sort of step beyond the program that one is given by a client and try to influence and express various issues that are critical at the time. Because I think if we only do the work that we're given, and so much of it is commercial, I think probably most of the construction that took place in that era that I was talking about is commercial.
Did it have influence?
No. I wasn't alone in that. The scientists, who were much more significant than me, didn't even have much influence.
Did you show it to the scientists?
No, but it was on. It was in an exhibition at the University of Colorado that had a number of other architectural pieces in it. Yeah.
Why do you think it's important for architects to do work like this, practicing architects?
Well, because I don't think anyone else in society is thinking about the environment other than for profit, for the most part.
No, architects are thinking about the environment, but they're designing, LEED certified sustainable buildings.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, and that's important. I'm not criticizing
No.
that. However, it may not be architecture. I think in relationship to this technological sort of development that's taken place, that coincides with the amount of construction that we've been doing, right? There's been a lot of interest in the technology of making, and that sort of dominates the concerns that maybe someone like Kahn or Wright had. Right? So it's very much a late 20th century sort of attitude, and it really is sort of connected to the various aspects of modernism and rationality. I think a lot of American business people welcomed rationalism because they could get rid of all of that costly decorative, parts of architecture of buildings, and get down to only building what they could lease, and make money from.
I mean, I tend to think, with my interest in fashion, that, big fashion houses will put up one or two runway shows every year, and nobody wears that stuff, but they are sort of really conceptual designs, and then the rest of the year then they put out the stuff that's going to be purchased. So that kind of a relationship between something that's produced for the market, and yet at the same time something that's publicly presented as conceptual, is missing in our
exactly. It's a perfect example.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a loss. We just don't tend to do it. In the old days, people like Cedric Price or Livius Woods or the Smithsons even, or even Corbusier, were publishing conceptual projects all the time.
Yes.
How did this all?
Well, I think
why did this get to be devalued in the architectural community?
I do think that the 60s and 70s there was a transformation that took place. I think you had the military events that occurred in the First World War, and then followed by the Second World War, and how the impact that had on various parts of societies throughout the world. And in the United States, of course, we had this enormous military machine that we developed during particularly the Second World War, that needed to go someplace, right? And you had all of this money that had already been made from it. And you had a group of people that were coming back from the war that wanted houses and so on, and all of this then gets commercialized by investors in the business community. At the same time, I mean, even Eisenhower warned us about the military industrial complex, right? And here we are with it probably dominating the biggest part of our budget in the United States. And then you look at other parts of the world, other countries, and the same thing is taking place.
So why did architects stop doing conceptual practice with that?
Well, I think they got so enamored, they got so involved in all of this other work that was going on.
They got seduced by the money.
They did. Well, they got seduced by the projects. I mean, I think some by the money, but others by the desire to build, right? I mean, most architects who, you wind up designing more buildings that don't get built than those that do get built.
But I still hear architects complaining about, I don't get to do the work that I want to be doing, so why don't they?
That's true.
Do conceptual work?
I don't know. I mean, they need to step up, and maybe that's what they want. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one of the interesting things now is that both Kathy and I are finally doing the work that we used to do it at night and on weekends. Now we can do it 7 days a week, right? Yes.
Let's talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. He was a conceptual design man. I mean, he had extensive practice, but he never shirked from establishing other projects, Mile High Towers and Broadacre Cities and so on. You were quite influenced by Wright, no?
I was, yeah. And I think it's unfortunate that he, in maybe 20 years ago, maybe I can't really pin down the date, but he became considered a 19th century architect.
Yes.
And that's sort of
instead of a futurist.
Right. Well, or even a contemporary.
Yeah. It's kind of like dated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Why did that happen?
Well, I think this amount of construction and the technology and the sort of economic investment just dominated the profession. Right? And
what was lost? What was Wright about to you?
Well, I think there's a connection between Kahn and Wright. I think that although Kahn is still revered, there is still a segment of the profession for a variety of reasons that don't look at his work the way maybe you and I do.
What's the connection between Wright and Kahn? Everybody talks about Kahn and Korb, but not that much about
Well,
Kahn.
that's probably a personal thing because I went from being interested in Wright and seeing his work before I went to Kahn and looked at his work. I mean, I think there's this this cultural thing. I mean, Wright was about an architecture, an American architecture, if you will, something that was coming from, you know, what this country was supposed to be.
Which is what?
Well, I mean, the frontier, right, and the sort of the landscape and the making of things.
Okay.
You know, if you go to Wright's buildings, I mean, they were serious structures and materials were beautifully put together. And I think there are aspects of Wright's buildings that where he introduced other program into the programs that he was given. There are aspects of his designs for the Johnson Wax building with the columns and the capitals and great sort of spaces for people to work in, you know, and the Guggenheim with its central space. I mean, he wasn't asked to do a building like that. That was the concept of it had also went beyond what he was given. You know? So
yeah, certainly. Yeah, he thought of his work as contributive to an articulation of what he thought life and culture and society could be, ought to be, should be, as did Kahn.
Right.
But these are exactly the things that the modernists got raked over the coals about, for being too prescriptive and utopian. Do you think that was all misplaced?
No, of course not. I'm doing the same thing they did. So no, I think too little of it is done, and I think we've become too materialistic.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, it takes us back to what we've done at the same time. In my lifetime, less than my lifetime, since 1950 to today, the population of the United States has doubled. The population of the Earth has tripled. And at the same time, we continue to use up the natural resources to build more and more and more, and most of it is built for profit.
Right.
So I think that's a significant problem. I think we need to step back and understand what we're doing.
And that you need the sort of distance and vision of a person.
You need independence.
Yeah.
And it concerns me that that more of this type of thinking doesn't take place in academia. You know, I think that I've been away from it for a while, and I never really haven't taught full time since '74. So it's always usually part time. But right now, there's the offices today. They want people to come from school knowing all of the computer programs, and, so which is very different than when I went to school and when I got out of school. I mean, there was this sort of apprenticeship attitude that offices had, not just good offices, all offices had.
Right.
The idea that you came out of school, they had a responsibility to teach you certain things that they would focus on, and the way they ran their office, right? That's sort of disappeared. It has disappeared a long time ago, but it's very prevalent today. And it's almost like it's a trade school.
No, I agree. Certainly, there's that sense to it.
But it's the industry that's demanding it. It's not and the schools are under pressure.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and rising cost of tuition.
Oh, yeah.
It's through the roof,
right.
And that puts a huge amount of pressure,
right.
Both on students, of course, but also on how we teach.
Right, and so that's
By contrast, Kahn, you were telling me took no salary and lived off his academic salary.
Well, he didn't consider architecture a business.
Yeah.
In some respects, particularly when we talk about it, that aspect of it, it probably wasn't the best place to work for so long.
Oh, it was the best place.
But I mean in relationship to knowing how to run an office, right?
No, but what we are talking about is what does it mean to run an office?
Right, yeah.
I mean, one definition of run an office is to maximization of profit. The other definition of run an architectural practice is something else.
Well, you mentioned profit. I never had a line item of profit.
You didn't?
No.
You
Even
had to grow-
WPA didn't have a line item of profit.
You drew a salary.
We drew a salary,
Yeah.
but we did work for that salary,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It wasn't what was left over we would go ahead and take.
Right.
You know, we would put most of it back into the firm if there was something. I mean, usually I'd be happy before WPA that I made my salary.
Yeah.
And there were years when I didn't.
Yeah.
But, you know,
But Kahn had a kind of a monastic, is that right? Monastic sense of purpose in his work.
how do you mean?
Like a monk. He worked in his office as a devotion to God.
We were, yeah, we could probably say we were,
You were all
minor monks.
You were all minor. You were.
We were all as dedicated.
Novice. What are there's a clerical term for
Yes,
this.
yes.
Novices or
Believers, maybe, I don't
know.
know. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah.
Monks in training.
Yes. Monks in training. Yeah. Well, I mean, we worked there at times without being paid.
Was there just because of my interests, was there a implicit dress code ever?
Oh, no.
No.
The people that worked in Kahn's office, not only did they come from different cultures and different parts of the world, but they also came from different economic groups. And so most of us were they either were middle income or lower income, and some maybe were higher income. But it was a very diverse group of people, unlike the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, when it was very much a gentleman's profession.
Right.
So,
How did that diversity play into the work or office culture?
well, I think because we were primarily not from, we were workers. Everybody helped one another. I mean, there were 25 people basically in the firm and Kahn was doing a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah.
And not only did we work long hours, but you'd have a senior person working on a project and got a gap, and they would go help someone else do something, just to get the project along.
Right.
I worked on Exeter for Whitton Scott. He was in charge of that project, and worked on the library and worked on the jack arches and one of the complex stairs. And I was in charge of Fort Wayne at the time. So everybody sort of helped one another.
So there was no sort of meticulous record keeping of billable hours.
Oh no, we all had, we definitely kept our hours, because our hours were billed.
Yeah.
It was Kahn's hours that weren't billed.
I see.
Yeah. And we had timesheets.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Who else did you, encounter as amongst the modernists? Did you meet Buckminster Fuller or any of the other big Americans?
I attended a lecture that Fuller gave at the University of Illinois, and it was advertised as Buckminster Fuller and the Movable Wall. And he saw that poster for it when he arrived. He was down in southern Illinois.
Yeah.
And came up and says, no, that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my architecture in relationship to Einstein's theory of relativity. And I was there with a couple of good friends, and the auditorium was full. And it went on 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. The lights were kind of dim. Students were leaving, continuing to leave. He'd walk back and forth, talking. No, not a lot of images, a lot of discussion or out of this explanation of his work. And
3-4 hours?
4 hours. And there was some of us still left. That was about it after
He didn't
4.
care how many people were.
I don't know if he could
coming
see
in.
us. He couldn't see very well at that. He had glasses that were pretty thick, and
So that's a strategy.
But we were, some of us were mesmerized
Yeah.
by his sort of directness,
Yeah.
and saying, no, that's not what I'm going to talk about, and then go on and on and on and on, and it was quite interesting, And I did learn. I mean, he knew he would weigh. He'd calculate the weight of his buildings, And I used to do the same thing, and I definitely did it at WPA.
You calculated the weight
all the
of
metal and that we would use, and where it would, what sheets it would come from, how could we maximize the amount of material coming out of the various sheets of material?
But did you weigh your buildings? Do you know
We
how
didn't
much
weigh-
your house weighs?
No,
Well-
but I would do portions of it, but
Yeah.
I never sort of put it all together. But we had an opportunity when we were doing the architectural graphics, because the objects were small, and there was another aspect to it. We needed to make sure that they were mechanically attached so that they could be modified, information could be changed, and so on. So we did do some houses with WPA. We did a large transformation of a large public space from a vehicular way to a pedestrian way at Washington State University. So we had opened WPA with the hope that we would do both architecture and graphic design. But it was interesting that we were able to detail everything to such finite terms, and be responsible for how they were going to be made.
Right.
And insist that they be made that way because of certain things that the fabricators wouldn't consider.
I mean, this is sort of the fascinating and unusual thing about when I look at your drawings about these urbanscapes in the air, is that these are supermassive projects, right? These are huge constructions imagined.
Right.
But at the same time, you're using a very craftsmanly kind of attitude to their drawing. I mean, they're like artworks. They're meticulously kind of drawn with precision and loving care.
Well, I mean,
it's this paradox.
It isn't if you grew up when I did and went to Kahn's office when I did, and his interest and demand of the quality of drawings.
What was that about? Why did he demand that?
His interest in everything he did. It needed to sort of be done at a high level.
Why was the quality of drawing famously such a big
Because
thing in Kahn's office?
It was through the drawing and the over the repetition of and tracing over and over and over again that the architecture was discovered. Was that process, and not that he would use that word, but it was that way of searching, and drawing was very important.
Is that what you're doing?
It's definitely what I do. There's a dialogue between me and a piece of paper and a pencil or pen, that there's a sort of equality that where I don't attempt to demand what the paper winds up bringing back. At times,
The paper talks to you?
Hopefully what I'm doing and how I'm thinking allows me to step beyond my own, and allow something else to enter. So I see a line move and meet another line, and from that I discover, but maybe I wasn't thinking about where it wasn't a preconceived, predetermined configuration, right? And so it sort of gets found through this method of working.
It's like, the line has its own,
Yes.
own life, vive.
Right.
It's aliveness, which sort of connects to what you were saying earlier about having respect for all forms of life, and not just animal life
Right,
and bird life,
right.
but in a sense the ethic comes
Material.
from having material life
Right,
too.
right,
Things,
right.
materials have life. I mean,
Right,
that was Kahn's
exact-
famous
right,
statement,
right.
asking the brick what it wants to be.
Yes, yeah.
It's
yeah.
out of a little bit of respect for the brick.
It is. I mean, I'm smiling because I purposely kept away from his verbal language because it was so personal. You know, I mean, only someone like Louis Kahn could make the statement, I asked a brick what it wanted to be, and it told me it wanted to be an arch, right? I mean, I could never say that without smiling, right? You know, or be considered, you know, it's serious.
You
right?
saw the line hang out with another line, and
yeah,
then they spoke to you.
But that's, yeah, okay. You know, it was a very personal language, and I understood that. And I understood the danger of being enamored with it and seduced by it. However, I was seduced by him, watching him draw. You know,
really?
And yeah, oh sure, and he did it constantly. And you know, everyone who worked there and worked with him talked about he needed to talk to someone, so he always was drawing when someone was there. But we were there, but he was very much internally involved with what he was doing.
I see.
Yeah. There was this
So why was
dialogue.
that seductive?
Well, to see the lines sort of move from this quietness, and then from words that were being asked or said, and then the lines were somewhat different in some way. You know, they had their own life.
Yeah.
There were words that had a life, and then there were the images on the paper that had a life.
Yeah.
And I focused on the images on the paper and the movement that took place on the paper.
It sort of reminds me of Jackson Pollock dropping paint, which had its own kind of life.
Right. Yeah, it's a sort of an ability to accept the material as an equal.
I mean, that's again back to the sort of having. It's not only multi-species respect, but material of the having respect for the otherness of everything.
You know, most of Kahn's buildings were built of very modest materials. You know, concrete block, brick.
Yeah.
Sure, I mean, we had stainless steel,
Yeah.
you know, and travertine, but you know, concrete. Concrete's a very modest material. You know, and so there, I have learned a respect for simple materials. And maybe there's a sort of connection with a socioeconomic connection there, where you don't have two hierarchies. You know, what's good and what's not so good. You know, so you don't look down or you're not negative towards a simple material because it isn't glamorous, and you can use it, and it has a purity to it. Because of its simplicity, like concrete block.
Right. As we move towards the end over here, I must insist on coming back to, because I hear this sort of democratizing kind of impulse in a lot of the things that you're describing, and sort of respect for the, let's say, the ordinary and the simple and the underdog and the everyday. Yeah. I mean, I can't help thinking, you know, this has to go back to a sense of habilitating respect for the very ordinary of the Hoboken, you know, versus the grand greatness of Paris or or Manhattan or you know, or anything. Is that a?
There's a specific connection. I mean, we were my aunt and uncle were in the garment industry, and cousins, and I spent time working with them. My mom was a seamstress, and I would work late at night when I was in high school with my cousins, piling up fabric, and they would cut it. You know, and so we'd see this transformation of these flat, irregular, what looked like irregular pieces of material, right? And then delivered to the seamstresses and turned into three-dimensional garments. Right.
Well, you were into fashion early.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I have some interesting stories which we won't go into today, but
too bad we should have started there.
Well, we'll have a drink and a cigar later on. But and my grandfather, my mom's dad, came from Sicily. What his dad and he did there was make architectural clay products. And then when he was in the United States, he was a furniture maker and he restored antiques. So there was this involvement of making things, you know. And I think from that being exposed to it at a very young age, I got very influenced by it.
The great love
I
of
think that's the
making,
connection.
making the ordinary. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Anthony. Thank you for coming out.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.